Hi, folks, and welcome back. We're into our second unit. Now we get to talk about the fun stuff. This is probably why most people get into forensics in the first place, and that is talking about trauma. As we mentioned in the first unit, you learned that we're really physical anthropologists and forensic anthropologists are most closely associated with working with bone. So most of the trauma that we're going to be looking at is skeletal trauma. Can somebody be killed and there's just flesh wounds? You bet. However, sometimes it nicks the bone. So even when we get down to the skeletal side of things, we can still sometimes detect things, but not always. Therefore, if they have flesh on them, they go to the medical examiner. If it's skeletonized, mummified, burned, or otherwise relatively defleshed, it goes to us. So today we're going to talk a lot about these different skeletal traumas and give you an overview. In the subsequent days in this unit, we're going to cover directly certain types of trauma, and we'll get into a lot more information on those. Okay, well, let's first start by defining what trauma is. Physical trauma means any severe injury. That is, if something happened to the individual that was severe enough to mark the bone, break the bone, or somehow show us that it happened in a skeletal context. For example, wounds from violence. Now, we have a specific term for violence between people, which is if there's an aggressor and a victim, we call it interpersonal, meaning two people are involved or more than one person. Violence. There is also violence against oneself, like suicide. There are also things like accidents and surgery, which are not violence. And remember, not all trauma is violence. So before we get too deep, let's talk about how trauma becomes really part of a case and where the importance comes in. First of all, there's three fundamental types of trauma. Premortem, that is trauma that happens before death. And this is indicated by signs of healing. Perimortem trauma. Now, this is what gets really interesting in a court case. This is trauma that happened at or around the time of death. No healing, but bone is reacting like it's still fresh bone, and there's certain things that we look for. We'll talk a little bit about that today. And finally, post-mortem trauma. That is trauma that happens to the bone after death, like being stepped on by a horse if the skull is slowly exposed and it's on a trail and a horse steps on it and the skull crunches. Can we tell the difference between that and the other two types of trauma? The answer is yes. The main reason is it reacts like a dry bone. The best analogy that anybody ever has come up with is the difference between like a green twig and a dry stick. So a dry twig, you can snap it and it'll break really cleanly, really easily. It's very brittle. And a green one tends to bend a lot. Before it breaks, it'll bend and fray and be really hard to break. That's fundamentally what's going on with bone. It's very similar. And we'll show you some images of these things. First, pre-mortem trauma. First of all, healed bone looks a lot like if you had taken a broken candle and melted it back together. If you look at the middle of this bone, I presume you're not having any trouble figuring out which part is the broken part right here. You can see how it's got this kind of smeared together look. This is obviously a displaced bone. It's not lined up perfectly because this bone probably didn't get put into a splint or anything else. It just healed itself together, but slightly offset. This is typical of pre-mortem trauma. We have a lot of bone healing. Perimortem trauma. Now we've got no signs of healing. You can see this person's face was smashed in. The bone is bending. Do you see over here in the green circle, we've got pretty clearly the bone doesn't line up where it's supposed to. It's bending. It's in odd positions. And that is a very typical thing of green or fresh bone. The other thing is we'll see these fractures that open up that sort of radiate out from the initial point of impact. The best way I can describe that is sort of like ice. Ice has a give to it. It's very tough stuff, and because it gives a little bit. Unlike glass, where if you press on glass, it breaks it's very brittle, depending on the type of glass, etc., etc. Then we've got this adhesion going on. This is where the little teeny tiny bits of bone are adhered to here. If this was a dry bone when this happened, if some horse came along and smushed this thing's face after it had been dead for, a year or so, the bone would be dry and all these little bits of bone would fall away, break away, and fall into or around the skull. Here we have these little bits of bone are all adhered in place. And there's a couple other ways that this could happen taphonomically, but generally speaking, this is associated with something called perimortem trauma. Okay, so look for bending, look for adhesion, and that's a dead giveaway that that bone was fresh when it was smushed. Finally, we have post-mortem. No signs of healing, no bending, no adhesion. The little bits of bone are gone. They've fallen away. The break itself is jagged and very brittle looking. It doesn't have that bending that you would find in a fresh bone. Okay? So that's the fundamental differences between those three types. Not all trauma is violence. Remember, trauma can be caused by accidents, dangerous lifestyles such as, skiing. Accidental can be ankle fractures, hand fractures, but there are certain types of fractures that coincide with violence. Things like perifractures, so called because you're holding your hands up to fend off an attack. These are very, very common in trying to defend yourself while being attacked by a blunt object. For example, they're also known as a nightstick fracture. Bone fractures, dislocation of joints, disruption of nerve supply, cultural modification, including cranial deformation, which is an old thing. That's just moving a baby's head around a little bit to make it look pretty. We still do that today, by the way. Tooth modification, tattooing, scarification, surgery, etc., 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 are all considered trauma because it shows up on the bone. It's a major thing that happened to the bone. What causes fractures? Well, generally they're caused by a direct blow to the bone, like a blunt force, bending, twisting, pulling, compression, structural failure, which is more associated with old age, like osteoporosis or other diseases that can weaken the bone. Okay? A fracture, by the way, is a break. I don't care how many times your coach, your sensei, Joe Rogan on UFC, how many people, your favorite sports star has said, oh, how many times have you heard this? It's just fractured, it's not broken. That's not true. Fracture and break mean the same thing. They're literally synonyms. They mean the same thing. So if you have a fracture, you've got a break. Now, the fracture can be incomplete, like a green stick fracture that doesn't go through the whole bone. You can have little tiny hairline fractures that don't break the bone away completely, but it's still broken. It's not the way it was before. It's like having a window in your car. If you have a fractured window in your car, you can bet you've got a broken window. That's just the way it is, okay? Okay, so quick test. Are we looking at pre, peri, post-mortem? What are we looking at? Can you guys tell? I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it before I answer it. This is, wait for it, pre-mortem. What? You're saying this guy survived this? Yup. What's more, look at the edges, you guys. You can see this was a brutal impact with a large weapon of some sort, probably a war club or something like that, where this person got clonked upside the head. like a baseball bat would do that. You can see bending. You can see these radiating fractures that we talked about. But look at the edges. Does that look like candle wax, like it's kind of smoothed over? You bet it does. Even along these cracks, look, it's healing in the middle. You see how this bone is weaving itself back together? Now, granted, this person didn't last very long. This person probably survived about 1 to 3 months and then succumbed. But this injury we would call premortem because they didn't die from it right away. They probably died from an infection months later. Huh? Less obvious than what you may think. But like I said, look at that edge. Look at the edges right around this defect here. See how smooth they are? As if somebody went in with a flame and melted that wax. That is key. Look for that type of thing and you will have yourself a premortem or a healed fracture. Okay? Some fractures have been given specific names. We're going to look at particularly the first 3 because those things are actually very associated with what we're looking for. We're going to look for things like a Colles fracture, a Perry fracture, a grenade thrower's fracture. Sprinter's fracture we're not going to pay attention to. Midnight fracture and another one that we're not going to pay attention to, although it's funny. And a boxer's fracture. I'll tell you really quick right now, a midnight fracture is so named. It's the fracture of the pinky toe, your little toe. And the reason it's called a midnight fracture is because people walking through their house in the middle of the night trying to go get a glass of water or something or use the bathroom and they kick the edge of the coffee table or whatever and break their toe. That's why it's called a midnight fracture because it happens in the middle of the night. The other ones, though, other than sprinter's fracture, are associated with interpersonal violence, not Colles fracture. Colles fracture is often mistaken for a Perry fracture, and we're going to talk about why that is and how they're different in a minute. This is a Colles fracture. What you can see here, this is somebody's outstretched forearm. It's their hand and arm, and you guys can probably see it's broken right here. This bone, which is known as the radius, here's the ulna, but here's the radius. The radius has broken and moved out of place. Now, why is a Colles fracture not associated with interpersonal violence? This is a slip and fall fracture. Now, it can happen. If you get into a fight or something like that and you're trying to save your life or whatever and somebody shoves you and you fall down, hands outstretched, and land, kind of catch yourself on your hands, you can break your hand this way. But it's more often associated with somebody just tripping and falling. Trip over a curb or something, outstretch your hand and boom, land on the palms of your hand, and it's too much for that bone to handle and it breaks. So this is more associated with an accidental fracture. It can be included if somebody has all kinds of other interpersonal violence fractures. This can be a part of that. But if this was the only fracture on the body, we would say, probably an accident. This is what it looks like after it's healed. And here we see Colles fractures. Again, we've got that kind of soft edge healing going on. Also, you can see this bone is clearly woven together. Here's another healed Colles fracture and yet another over here. The ulna in these situations is generally not broken. This one has been broken, but that's post-mortem. A Perry fracture, also known, as I mentioned before, as a nightstick or fending fracture. This is what happens, and you can try it right now. If you put your arm up trying to protect your head, let's just say, throw your hand up. I guarantee you right now, your pinky is on the outward side. Your thumb is probably pointing toward your head. Your pinky is out. That's because that's the only way the arm moves. And if you feel the outward bone right there, can you feel the bone that would be hit by the nightstick or the baseball bat? That bone that you're feeling right along the edge of your outstretched forearm, It ends at your elbow. You can feel that bump on your elbow. That's called the ulna. That's one of the two bones in the forearm. The other bone that was involved with the Colles fracture is the other bone on the thumb side of your forearm, known as the radius. So, perifracture, so named because you would be parrying off blows, is a fracture of the shaft of the ulna when struck by some object. It's more common on the left side than the right because somebody hitting you with a baseball bat is usually going to go to their dominant side. Most dominant in today's population is right-handed. So, perifractures tend not to affect the radius bone, which on both of these images you can see one of the two forearm bones is broken. That's the ulna. The other one is intact. That's the radius. So this is the radius. Here's our ulna bone. Here in the shaft of the ulna is broken. This is a perifracture. Sometimes the fracture can go through both bones. And here's a really interesting one. This is 2,500 years ago, Egyptian medicine. And what you see is a splint. This is a cast, basically, put on this person's arm. Would have been trussed up by some sort of a fibrous material, like a rope or a something, and held there to try to hold those bones together so that they heal. Obviously, this person did not live long enough for that bone to heal back together, those two bones to heal back together. Grenade thrower's fracture happens to the upper arm, and of course it's associated with throwing a grenade. There's a long story about this, but it's known as a spiral fracture. It breaks in a spiral form up the long bone here. There's another spiral fracture that's common in accidents, which is associated with the lower leg bone. But the grenade thrower's fracture can be a spiral to the midshaft, or it can be a break in the neck of the humerus where the humeral head connects to the rest of the bone. These were generally caused by a twisting motion with a bent elbow, and it's associated with throwing a grenade and breaking the arm. Long story with that. Ask me on Friday about that. All right, a boxer's fracture. This one is a very common fracture. We see this amongst people who are training in martial arts, any type really, that includes punching, so that of course includes boxing. And so we call it a boxer's fracture. The irony is boxers tend not to break this bone. It's people who are not trained in how to throw a proper punch that tend to break this. It's caused from over, I guess, curving the punch so that you hit with the two last knuckles, the pinky and the ring finger knuckles. If those hit a solid object, generally the metacarpals involved with those two bones. So let me drive you over here. Here's the pinky. Here's the ring finger. You can see right here the metacarpal, this is MC5, the fifth metacarpal, has broken. Right along where you see those two little arrows, you can see the fracture. This, and here's an inset picture of it right here. This is a very common fracture. We see this amongst teenage boys all the time. They get angry and hit a wall or something. We see it amongst teenagers of both genders, to be honest, but they're usually healed. This is a typical interpersonal fracture. This, along with fractures to the face, things like that, which go along with getting into a fight. Okay? Boxer's fracture. Healed fractures can be obvious, like we saw that one in the very middle of this picture. We saw that before, blown up when we were looking at what a healed fracture looks like, and you can see these angulations, these spurs of bone that stick out. If you're familiar with what the bone is supposed to look like, you can usually see a healed fracture quite obviously. Here's an ulna which is bent, here's another ulna which is bent, here's a radius that's got this thickening in the middle, here's an offset radius here which is quite obvious. Here are two humeri, these are your upper arm bones. Here we have a clearly broken one, and here the epicondyle of the radius has been of the humerus, has been broken. So they can be really, really obvious. On the other hand, they can be harder to see. First of all, I've got two questions for you. Number one, is this an adult hand or a child's hand? And number two, can you find the healed fracture? The answers to those questions are, it is a child. This is a juvenile. How can you tell? Well, this is a hand. And right here, you guys see these? These are those epiphyseal fusion plates. These are those areas they have not fully fused. So we can say this is a juvenile skeleton. This person would probably be somewhere around the age of 15 to 16. Down here is the healed fracture. Now, this is the thumb, first finger, second finger, ring finger, pinky. What type of fracture would we call that? It's a boxer's fracture. Well done if you got it. Okay, again, perimortem fractures. There are a lot to them, so we're going to go through a few things, and as I mentioned before, these things are really what we like to concentrate on. So let's talk a little bit about perimortem or fresh fractures. Like I mentioned, the bone is going to behave as if it's still alive because it was when the fracture happened. But then the individual died shortly thereafter, therefore there is no healing. Here you can probably see what happened. There was a massive blow to the side of this individual's head. The right side of their head has been stove in by probably a large implement like a baseball bat or something to that effect. Now, there's several things I really want you to look at, but in this one, we have first and foremost the radiating fractures, and you can clearly see along these edges of everything, there is no healing at all. That is raw, broken edges. You guys see that? Now, this one, we don't have any adhered bone that I can see anyway, but we do have the other one. Do you guys see where this is bent? Let me draw your attention to this radiating fracture right here. You see how this wall and this wall, these used to be the same bone. They have broken, and you can see these ends don't line up. This part is pushed in. It bent inward. Here you see the same thing. This part has bent inward. This part has what we call hyperlux. In other words, it's over the bone. It has smushed over. It's kind of because this one pushed in, this entire area cracked and sort of slid a little bit this way. You guys see that? This bone is also bending up here, and here we have radiating, and this is called a concentric fracture, which we'll talk about later on. No healing, bending involved. That tells us perimortem, at or around the time of death. This was associated, not surprisingly, with this person's death. Okay? Clues for identifying perimortem fractures. First of all, the fresh bone is more flexible than dry bone. It bends before it breaks. Radiating fractures fracture around the point of impact and go outward. They radiate out in relatively straight lines. Adherent fragments, okay, and spiral fractures of long bones are typical of fresh bone. We saw a spiral fracture when we were looking at the grenade thrower fracture. That is a fracture that happens because of a twisting motion. And you'll see it goes in a spiral, like a corkscrew around the bone. Okay? Ignore that archaeological context. That was something I added in for a different lecture and forgot to take it out. Sorry. Okay. Couple other things that happen. Here we can see this individual had a massive blow to the top of the head. Now, first of all, let's look at our familiar things. We have radiating fractures. We have bending going on. Okay, here's another radiating fracture. Here we have what we call concentric. Here's a radiating, but this is a concentric fracture. it's going around the same center as this because this part bent inward. When this took the brunt of the blow, you can see this part bent inward, this part bends inward and cracks right along here. Oops, I can't follow it. Right, there we go. There's the mouse. This is a radiating fracture going straight out, straight out, straight out. This is a concentric fracture. It's like in a circle around the same center as where the blow happened. This would sort of be said the same way. This is a concentric fracture. You can see it's bent downward. Now, something else is happening here because it's a skull. Skull sutures, okay, that's the squiggly lines that we see where two bones in the skull come together. These are like fingers. You can imagine if you interlace your fingers. That's kind of what's going on. There's little fingers in either bone, and they kind of interweave together and hold together, just like interlacing your fingers, okay? But in fresh bone, those fingers are bendy. Not very much, but hey, if something smashes them on top of the head, those fingers are going to let loose. And that's what's happened. What you're looking at here, this is not a radiating fracture, although it follows sort of the same rules. What we've had is all these little fingers have let go of each other. And what we call this is a separated suture, or suture separation, okay? Here we have adherent fragments. There's some little fragments. These would have fallen away if this was dry bone when this happened, but they're adhering, okay? It's kind of cool. Here's our concentric fractures again. So here we have the site of impact, right? So a huge stone or blow has happened here. Now, it's pushed in right here. We have radiating fractures going in straight lines out. But then we have this circular fracture. That's because all this bone here was trying to bend inward at the site of impact. And where it's bending, crack, it breaks. So we have a concentric fracture. This is very common with fresh bone. Dry bone won't do that. And then down here, look at this. You've got bending going on. This bone here, this piece of bone, has broken away from the other bone that it was connected to because of that massive blow. Okay? Here we have, you guys saw a much better image of this before. This is that healed fracture from that massive side fracture. Remember I showed you a while back, we were showing this looks like melted candle wax. This person lived for a few weeks. Here's another one. Now this is literally a ball grape shot, which was an old cannon shot. It's kind of like a shotgun blast out of a cannon. And it has penetrated the outer table of this person's skull. It killed him. But here we have a radiating fracture. And there's only one thing I wanted to show you about this, which is interesting. And that is, radiating fractures, when they come down, when they get to the eye orbit, they tend to hit the eye orbit, skirt around the outside, and then continue on. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because, like the Romans taught us, this is an arch. It's a very, very powerful structure. It's very strong. So the arch will basically transmit the power down here, and it'll continue down. So it'll go around the arch. It's kind of interesting. This is literally the best photograph I have of adhesion. Adherent bone fragments. Here you see a little bit of bending, right? You see all this bending and this popping up and all this movement of the bone. But more importantly, you see these tiny little bits that are in here. They're completely broken from all the rest of the bone. But they're held in place because the bone itself is filled with blood and other dampening materials, I guess, for lack of a better word. And they're held together by the flesh. So they're held in place and they stick in place. They don't fall away like what would happen if this was dry bone. Dry bone is like chalk. It just kind of crumbles and breaks. It's not that easy to break as chalk, but you get the idea. It's that same dry, crumbly idea. Wet bone is more like coconut, like hitting a coconut shell. It's got that give that makes it super tough. Does that make sense? Again, this archaeological context. But what I want to stress here is you can see a lot of these perimortem injuries if we're looking at a mass grave. The difference would be, okay, if this was a mass grave from somebody who came in and killed a bunch of people and threw them in a pit, right, that we see with a mass grave, or mass graves can also be, what if you have a plague, like the bubonic, the Black Plague, and a lot of people, you're burying loved ones, but you don't want to get sick. So you hastily throw them all into a pit. It's called a plague pit. And we find these throughout history. So if you find a whole bunch of bodies, it doesn't necessarily mean that a serial killer or a war crime has gone on here. It could be that there was a plague and they threw everybody in. But the way we tell the difference, if they have perimortem damage, then we can say, oh, this is from violence. This isn't from disease. Okay? Perimortem injuries can also be indicated with abnormal positioning of the bones. Perfect example. If you look closely, you guys can see his leg ain't right. There's a fracture here. It's a massive fracture through his thigh bone. This is called the femur. And there's two things going on, which is weird here. First of all, you'll notice it's in anatomical position, with the exception of this bone broken. These two bones, these two ends should be here and here. They've overlapped. What's happened there? Any ideas? And how do we determine that as perimortem? It's a clean break through and through. How can we say this guy was alive when that break happened? How do we determine that this break didn't happen when they were excavating the bones out of this grave? This is what's gone on. In life, your thigh is surrounded by massive muscles. Your quadriceps and your hamstring muscles on the backside are big muscles. If you hit your thigh hard enough to break it, what are those muscles around it going to do? They're going to do the only thing muscles can do. They contract. They pull. And if you have the muscles in the thigh pulling, what's going to happen? If these two bones offset, which can happen from the break. So if the break comes in at a very high angle here, bang, breaks this off, knocks this bone this way. Then when these muscles all around it contract, it's going to shorten this up. It's going to pull these bones beside each other. And that's exactly what's happened. So we know this guy had living, active muscle around this bone when it broke. Now, how do we know this is perimortem? Well, there's no healing. Furthermore, there is a massive artery that runs down the inside of your thigh called the femoral artery. And if you break your femur like this, you can bet that artery broke. If that artery broke, that person probably bled out very quickly, meaning they died pretty quick. Okay? There are a few other fracture patterns that show us something that happened. Now, here are some very informative pictures that we can look at. First of all, typical sedan versus pedestrian. You'll notice where the bumper is on cars. You can test this out by walking in front of your car right now. Not while it's moving. But where does a car hit a pedestrian first? Right here, lower leg. Here we've got one that actually happened. This is taken from a traffic camera. This gentleman, for some reason, wasn't looking. This car ran up on him, hit him right here. See where his lower leg is? Right in front of the bumper. So what's it do? It breaks that leg and sends him flying. This has a very typical pattern. This is called a butterfly fracture. It happens in all sorts of bones, long bones, particularly in the mid shaft. Now, the reason, by the way, that all bumpers in most nations hit somewhere around the lower leg is important because it's the safest place to hit somebody. That'll keep them from driving over you. You usually go up and over instead of down and under, which is much more deadly. And it's not going to break your thigh, it's going to break your tibia usually. And it breaks it in this very typical pattern. This is called a butterfly fracture. It's so named because somebody thought this looks like a butterfly, but it causes this pyramid-shaped fracture on one side and a straight fracture on the other. So here it is in real life. We have, here's the point of impact. It radiates, breaks off this chip of bone, and makes this very typical look. This is a perimortem blunt force trauma pattern. Okay? It's very typical. So, was it by violence or accident? Well, usually death by violence shows us a lot of these specific injuries, like facial injuries, injuries to the jaw, injuries to the nose, injuries to the top of the skull, the cranium. We often have perifractures. We often have broken ribs. Think about things that get beaten up when people are in a fight. Think about UFC, right? When people are fighting interpersonally, parts of your body get broken. These are typical places we'd see that. Conversely, think about the way people get hurt if they're a rock climber or a runner or a dancer or something like that. Where do they get injured? Well, now we're looking at legs, feet, sometimes the hips, sometimes the coccyx, which is your tailbone, right? That's from falling on your butt. These are the types of fractures we see in accidents. So sometimes the patterning can tell us what we're looking at, but not always. Also, if we see a fracture that's caused by an implement like sharp force, for example, across the throat, we can assume violence. Gunshot wounds, we can assume violence. Although gunshot wounds can also be accidental and they can also be suicidal. So there's all sorts of things going on here, as with any other thing. Knife injuries can be the same. So generally these areas that we look at, accidental, things like Colles fractures, broken ankles, depressed skull fracture in the frontal bone, which is your forehead. That's when you bonk your head into something like a low-lying, I don't know, doorway or something like that. Lumbar region, that's your lower back. Okay, patellae, those are your kneecaps. If you fall really violently on a hard surface, like say you're skateboarding or something and you fall off and you land on your kneecap, you can break that kneecap in half. Toes, finger amputations, these things are typically accidental. Violent fractures, now we're talking those perifractures, those broken knuckles, boxer's fractures, depressed fracture on the left side of the skull. Why left? Because again, people tend to go for their heavy side first. So if you're facing me and I'm right-handed and I'm swinging a baseball bat, it's going to hit you on the left side of your head, right? Decapitation, throat slice, broken neck, evidence of weapons, broken ribs, things like that. These tend to be more associated with violence, okay? Interpreting causes of fractures is fairly difficult sometimes and fairly easy other times. Depressed fracture of the skull can sometimes match a weapon. So if you're looking at a baseball bat or a hammer, things like that, okay? Embedded projectiles, like here we've got an arrow to the sternum. This is the chest cavity. Here we've got a spear point in the back of the skull. These are obviously kind of ancient. Actually, this is from the Custer battlefield collection, where they find a skull with an arrow point. Well, this is probably more of a spear point in the skull. It's sort of a coup de grace. Perifractures, etc., etc., etc. Okay? Now, here is something that people lose sight of very quickly, especially people who are new to forensics, think about the progression of the tools of violence, right? Started with clubs, moved up to knives and swords and arrows and spears, now gunshots and explosives. What's next? Lasers? We don't know. But the point is, if they killed in the past, they can still kill. So you can't forget what a club does to a head, because people still bash each other to death all the time. People still use swords. Think about a sword you can buy on the internet, right? You buy a samurai sword and go outside and stab somebody, cut their head off with it, just like they did in the past. It's still deadly. Just because it's an ancient weapon doesn't mean modern violence can't be done with it. Okay? Keep that in mind. So people get confused when they see things like this. Here you can see, quite obviously, I hope, this is what we would call sharp force trauma. It's a sore of some sort. Quick question. Look at the back view. Look at this view, and this view, and this view, and this view of this skull. And let me ask you, do you see evidence of premortem, postmortem, or perimortem? I hope that you said perimortem, because the thing I'm trying to point out here, you guys see this bending, the radiating fractures? That's what all this is. The bending here, the bending here. What we have is what we call sharp force trauma. Is this modern or ancient? Is this like some medieval warfare thing? Nope. This is from either Somalia or Rwanda, I forget where, but this is a machete chop to this individual's head. It was perimortem. It may not have been the blow that put this person down or even killed them, but it happened at or around the time of death. It certainly would have killed them, but this is more than likely a coup de grace where the person was already on the ground. They just went in and chopped it. Okay? So the point I'm making with both these two slides is, even though they're using tools that are associated with the past, don't assume it's an ancient thing. Okay? Last one I'm going to leave you with is a peculiar one. Here we've got a knee joint, and we're looking at the lower leg bones, okay? So here's the femur. The patella is up here. That's the kneecap. Femur, here's the knee. Here's the lower leg bone, the tibia, and the fibula. Now you can see the tibia has been quite broken. Here's the riddle. What caused this fracture? There are several clues. First of all, it's broken into a lot of different pieces. Do you see that? It's broken here, here. There's all kinds of bits and pieces here. It's broken here. The thing is shattered. And the other weird thing is the fibula, this tiny little bone on the side, is not broken at all. So imagine something big enough to smash into this bone and break it. It's not a butterfly fracture, and it did not break this bone. There's one other big giveaway here, and that is these little bits here. Do you see these little things? Have a guess at what you think caused this. I don't know if I want to tell you. I'll tell you on Friday. Ask me during the Friday get-together meeting, and I'll tell you what caused that fracture. Okay? All right. Until next time, you guys have a good one, and it's been good.